Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of Lost and Founder. It's great to be back, and this week's topic, slightly different. I wanted to talk about one of my all-time idols and huge inspiration to me throughout my life, Steve Jobs. I'm sure anyone listening knows the name already, but Steve was obviously the founder and CEO of Apple, and recently marked 10 years since he passed away, which is quite remarkable. So yeah, I wanted to sort of talk about how Steve Jobs has influenced me over the years. Aside from just wearing a polo neck on occasions, he has influenced me in many other ways, and I thought I'd dive into that on today's episode. So let's dive in. I wanted to talk about a story of how I got into Apple and how I ended up using a Mac. But I also wanted to talk about 3 ways Steve Jobs influenced me and has inspired me. But yeah, I thought a story about how I ended up becoming interested in Apple would maybe be a good starting place. And I guess for anyone who knows me even vaguely well will know that I for a long time have been quite, I don't know, I guess some might say obsessive with Apple. I'm often one to watch keynotes and want to have a huge desire to buy the latest Apple product. And I guess, you know, at some point that started, and at some point that was triggered for me. and I started getting interested in this company, this corporate entity that makes consumer electronics. And that's kind of a bit, you know, from a totally distant standpoint, that's kind of an odd thing, isn't it? But I guess it maybe speaks volumes of the man who started it all. But yeah, I guess I thought I'd maybe talk about that because maybe it shows, it sort of underlines why I eventually became quite inspired by the CEO, the founder, Steve Jobs. So I guess when I was a kid growing up, my parents both were in quite creative industries. My dad was always in advertising, and my mum she was working at various design agencies. And I remember as a kid always loving drawing and loving sketching and loving art. And I remember at school, even primary school, art was one of my favorite lessons. And so weekends or whenever I had spare time, sometimes, instead of running around outside or going crazy in the street, I would draw things. I'd sketch things. I'd draw cars. I'd draw buildings. I'd draw gadgets and inventions. And I always remember Mum taking my sister and I to her office, and this was a design agency that a friend of hers ran, and they were all doing design work, but they were doing it on, well, at least at the start, mostly they were doing it with pens and paper. But increasingly, as I was growing up, I saw them doing more and more on computers. And they had these computers that had like transparent plastic and that looked space age. And I started seeing this Apple logo on like the keyboard and on this mouse that had just one button. And I saw these people doing creative work and designing things and making things on computers in front of screens. And it sort of started to indicate to me that computers were a vehicle for creating and for channeling creative energy and for making things happen in the wider world. And I think that was something that sat in the back of my mind for a long time, like whether I knew it or not as a kid. And then I was very fortunate as I was growing up. I think as I was in my teens, my later teens, at my dad's company, the ad agency, they had a designer working with them, and for whatever reason they were getting rid of a Mac, and it was a Power Mac for anyone who knows what that is. And it was this big Perspex thing, very powerful at the time computer, very professional computer. And I was fortunate enough to basically have the opportunity to take this home when it was no longer needed. And that was the start of my journey into becoming a Mac user. And I was incredibly excited about this because suddenly, I think it was the first time I actually truly had a computer of my own. And it was a different computer to what all my friends and what other people had. Other people, and at school, all the computers were these computers where the programs were for spreadsheets and doing presentations and for writing documents, and they felt like machines for work. They felt like machines for getting tasks done efficiently. They felt honestly like machines that were like drudgery, to be honest, in beige boxes. And at my school, computing and IT felt like a very secondary at best subject, if a subject at all, and that computing was this thing that you had to do in the workplace, because that's how you submit a report, and that's how you process data. But this Apple computer that I'd been fortunate enough to get my hands on showed me that actually no, these computers can be used for creating things, for drawing things, for producing artwork, for doing stuff with videos, for doing stuff with photography. And it's more of an instrument for creation rather than a tool for getting work and reports done. And that was incredibly exciting to me. and so as a kid, I started, or teenager, whatever you want to call it, I started tinkering with this computer and learning about it more, and it just so happened to coincide with this renaissance of Apple and the Mac as this actually quite compelling and modern computing platform. And Apple itself was going through a real change as I was getting to know this computer. The introduction, they went from a switch from basically Mac OS 9 to Mac OS 10, which is essentially what all Macs run on today. But Mac OS 9 was this very grayscale, very quite dull looking interface, and that was what the Mac I had was running when I got it. And I started learning how to install software and take risks of like updating the software, and I could even update some of the components. And what I started to do was learn about the creative programs I could get, like Adobe, and at the time Macromedia made programs like Dreamweaver to make websites, and they made programs like, they made Flash, and you could make interactive games with Flash. And there was also tools like Illustrator and Photoshop. And so over time, this was how I got into Apple, this is how I got into the Mac. And then I guess the rest is history. I ended up wanting to get an iPod, which was obviously the coolest music player you could possibly have, and suddenly, I think I was one of the first kids. I was very fortunate, one of the first kids to have an iPod in my school, because I was just so geeked out on Apple and this company and how cool their stuff was, and this cool company from California made it, and they had a cool British designer as well called Johnny Ive. And so gradually I just became more and more interested in, I would say obsessed with this company called Apple, and at the helm throughout all of that to introduce every product, every announcement, probably every written word in those press releases that I would read about new products, and every keynote I could watch was Steve Jobs, and so that got me very interested in how this person led and ran what has become one of the, I think maybe the world's most valuable company. So that's my little story into the journey my journey into Apple and getting to understand who the hell Steve Jobs was. And next, let's talk about some of the things I've been inspired by Steve on. So I really wanted to just break this down into 3 sections, or 3 thoughts. There's so many aspects that Steve Jobs has been, I guess, an influence, whether I know it or not. But I think the 3 things I wanted to talk about one was his showmanship and the importance of showmanship in business. Another was simplicity and a focus, arguably obsession on simplicity. And the third was just on the wider thoughts and philosophy on life. And so, yeah, starting with showmanship, I guess pretty much the reason I was aware of Steve Jobs was through my interest in Apple and how they had such a flair for introducing products that were eye-catching, that were attention-grabbing. And I guess when you think about showmanship, you think about Steve Jobs getting on stage and announcing a new product to the world. And I think often a lot of people along the way have felt that, Apple's this company with lots of really fancy marketing, and the products are no better than anything else, and it's just marketing, and people that buy it, they're buying it into the marketing. But I've never really seen it that way. Obviously, I've always felt that at the core, Apple's always built very opinionated, but also truly as good as it possibly can. It's built good products, and that the marketing comes almost easily when you build really good, really opinionated products that people want. And I guess from my understanding, Steve Jobs was instrumental in bringing that back to Apple when he returned, and he was instrumental in that when he was there in the first place. But when you see how Apple veered off of its course while he was gone, it's pretty clear that so much of that came from Steve's opinions and his way of doing things. And I feel that the showmanship almost comes from a sense of excitement about the products that he was unveiling, but also I think the showmanship also was actually an element of honesty from Steve Jobs. Like I don't think you can be a truly great showman if you don't believe in what you're unveiling, and you don't believe you're unveiling the best product you possibly can build at the time. And I think that showmanship really resonated with me, and it made me think about how you make things and how you think about marketing something in combination with how you make things. You don't just build this product and slap some marketing on at the end, or you don't make a feature and then slap some design on after to make it look nicer. You think about all of these things in this extremely hard to define and order group together, and you think about it all intertwined, and that's how you build exceptionally great or insanely great products and do insanely great marketing, when all those things are thought of together. And I think that also comes from that showmanship and that ability to present things that grab attention and tell a story. That comes from having great taste too. And I think that so much of that stuff's traceable straight back to Steve Jobs. And I guess, I've always been inspired by how well Steve Jobs could present things on stage in the keynotes, and how well they could tee things up to tell a good story, and just the admiration for how that focus, it's almost such an unbelievably difficult thing to do at a company at the size of Apple, and I just think that's been hugely inspiring, and something I've always strived to try and in some way, shape or form set my sights on, and try to in some way, I don't know about match, but I think try to work towards how to have showmanship that even comes anywhere close to the levels that Steve Jobs and Apple at the time had. Second key area where Steve Jobs has really inspired me and influenced me has been an almost uncompromising desire for simplicity in pretty much everything. I mean, maybe someone who looks at Apple's ways of paying tax around the world would question simplicity on some levels, and I am sure there's many parts of the Apple business today that far from simple. But I guess from a product perspective, a marketing perspective, a pricing perspective, Apple has always, for a company of its size, valued simplicity to such a huge degree. And I think it's so easy to take that for granted when you are an individual or even a small business, that of course it should be that way. Of course, a product should be designed like that, or of course the pricing should work like that, or of course that's the marketing message you would take with that product. But I think that often that simplicity is totally in contrast to the challenges and complexity and difficulty of achieving that level of simplicity. If you think of even just any conversations you might have with your own team, or maybe even you've had with friends about any topic that could be difficult, like maybe you've had conversations about even the phone you have and how it's designed and things you like and dislike about it. I can only begin to imagine how difficult it is in a company with thousands, tens of thousands of employees, how difficult it is to try to ultimately do things that appear so simple, that have such a crisp and clear message, that are so well considered, that are so simple at the end of the day. It is incredibly difficult, and I think so much of that focus on simplicity stems right back from Steve Jobs setting the example and the importance of that as a core tenet of how Apple has run. And I think when you think about it, it's like throughout the history of Apple products, they have done things that have been incredibly crazy, I guess, or that, like, I can't imagine a company of that size, any other company, doing something like that. That people may call it marketing gimmicks, like removing the floppy disk drive, or removing the CD and DVD drive, or later on removing the headphone jack. But those things don't happen by accident, and they don't happen by a company that doesn't have clear values, and perhaps one of the clearest values being a huge respect for simplicity, and using simplicity as almost like a north star for product design. And that you constantly have to battle complexity. You have to constantly fight complexity, because it is always the natural path of any company, product, discussion. Things always go more complex because you always want to satisfy more people. You always want to take more feedback and insight and input on. You always want to appeal to more people. Things naturally get more complex over time, but simplicity is the antidote to that, and simplicity is the fight you need to bring. And there's a fantastic book called, I think it's called Insanely Simple, by which I'll link to in the show notes, and essentially it's a whole book about how Apple has used simplicity to succeed, whether that's through product design decisions, marketing decisions, pricing decisions, naming decisions, all sorts. And I think so much of that is traceable straight back to Steve Jobs and having that obsession with it himself. Another area I feel that Steve Jobs has had an influence on me is a pretty big one, and that is more on his philosophy on life. And I think if you haven't already, there's a fantastic speech that Steve Jobs gave. It wasn't about a product, it wasn't about a new Apple store or a financial update. It was a speech to Stanford University, Stanford commencement speech. So if you Google that, I'm sure you'll be able to find it if you haven't seen it before. But it's not a long speech, but in it, Steve talks a lot about his life, and it's broken into 3 parts, and he talks about different stages of his life and different things he's done and different consequences of things that he's done. But I think from that, and from hearing many other anecdotes and stories about Steve, it's extremely clear that he is a very deep thinker, and one that thought a lot about the world around him and about the life he wanted to lead and the legacy he wanted to leave behind. He wanted to leave a dent in the universe, and I think it's pretty clear he managed to achieve that to some extent, rather successfully. But in that commencement speech, I think there are just a couple of things that really stood out to me, and one of them was that he talked about his journey, and he went to university briefly and ended up dropping out, and he ended up stumbling into classes on typography, and he then talked about how he learned about typography and kerning and serif sans serif fonts and why and the benefits of different fonts and different letter forms and the beauty of typography. And you question why that would be at all interesting to someone who wanted to start a computer company in the around the late 70s, early 80s, and obviously later on the Mac was the first computer that shipped with fonts, with the ability to actually choose which font you used to write a document. And it's obviously something we all take for granted today, that you can pick from hundreds or thousands of fonts on your computer, and anyone can choose whatever typeface and be creative with that. But it's not necessarily an obvious chain of events. And in that speech, Steve Jobs talks about how you can't look at these things at the time and know where they're going to take you. You can't join the dots looking forward, you can only join them looking backwards. And I've used that at times to think about life experiences, and where sometimes it's worth going off the beaten track and going and taking a path that might take you into unknown territory, but sometimes that can take you into really exciting or interesting places, and you can't predict where that's going to take you ahead of time. You can only look back and see how things connected. And it's sometimes a good exercise, actually, to look at some of the things that you appreciate and value most in your life and try to trace them back to where they started, or what events and decisions caused those things to happen. Might be an interesting exercise if you have time, because I do that every now and again, and it's quite fascinating, actually. And then the other thing in that commencement speech that I just thought was quite valuable was he said that life is short. You don't have a lot of time on this planet. No matter how much time you have, no one's lived forever, and that life is short, and you shouldn't live your life in someone else's shoes. Don't waste your life living someone else's life, or trying to live based on how other people want you to live. Make sure you live your life, because you only get one, and try to make sure you do something great with it, and to wake up every morning and ask yourself whether you're going to enjoy what you're doing today, whether you're excited for the day ahead. And if you find yourself looking in the mirror too many times and saying, I'm not going to enjoy today, then try to find a way of correcting that, and look at what you can do to change that, because you don't have forever. We all have a short life on this planet, which we're blessed with, and it's in each of us to do the best we can, and to do the best work we can, to live the best life we can, and to try to look for ways we can do that, and to do the things that truly make us who we are, to live to our full potential. And I think Steve Jobs did that truly in the short time he was on the planet, and I hope that I can do that with my life, and do as much as I can to put my own small dent in the universe. And I hope that you might be inspired to as well. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much everything I wanted to say on Steve Jobs today. I'm sure there's more that I'll be kicking myself I haven't said, but I don't want to veer off into too much of a tangent on what I think of the latest iPhones or Macs or whatever. I just wanted to talk about some of the higher level, maybe the deeper stuff that Steve has influenced over the years, and I hope it's been interesting. So thanks very much for listening, and if you enjoyed the show, let me know. If you didn't, let me know too, and I'll use that to calibrate what I talk about in future episodes. So thanks again, and catch you next time. Cheers.